Nobody thought a dead battery would start everything else. The car had been quiet under the noon sun, a black shape swallowed by dust and heat on the edge of Lago's traffic. Sweat tracked through Jacob's shirt in thin rivers, grease stitched his fingers. He knelt by the engine with a rag, thumbed a cable that refused to give life, and watched a woman in a white scarf stand at the curb with a face like marble and worry in her hands. Jacob had learned to move quickly when the city stalled. The workshop was a rectangle of rust and promise, a roof that rattled in harmattan winds, tires stacked like tired idols. The radio muttered news unnecessary to people who kept their heads down and their pockets empty. His name was known for cheap honesty and for not flattering customers with false hope. It was enough to buy bread and a sachet of milk when the month stretched thin, but never enough to smooth the small disasters that always found their family. A school fee overdue, a landlord who loved reminders, a daughter who needed shoes for a christening. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked to the curb where the woman waited. The engine was stubborn, but not mean, just another thing to be negotiated. He squatted, peered into the grid of metal, held his breath with the same thrift he had learned to stretch words. Her car was the sort that hummed in silence when it was pleased, lacquer that drank the sun, upholstery that smelled faintly of sandalwood. It seemed to belong to another country of living. "Battery gone," Jacob said, and his voice didn't carry the apology he wanted. It was a thing of fact, not drama. She smiled, a small thing at the edges of her eyes. "I have a driver," she said, "but he'll be late." There was a patience in her voice that didn't belong to the urgency of a woman stranded. It was more like somebody who had the luxury to wait. He got to work. Wrenches sang, and the battery coughed. Hands that had coaxed engines back to the world did it again, and sweat dried to a fine dust on his brow. When the car shivered awake, it was like watching a small miracle. The woman watched him as if she were studying a sketch. "You must come," she said when he finished. Her accent softened the city into something less harsh. She fumbled in her bag and produced a card, heavy and white, embossed like a coin. "If you ever need work, call me. I like to keep people around who can fix things." Jacob stared at the card until the letters on it blurred. Amanda Okoro, it read in restrained serif. Beneath it, a line designated her as the head of multiple companies. Beneath the companies, a phone number that seemed to lead to a harmless shore. She offered a generous tip, too generous, and though he tried to refuse, she would not hear of it. She pressed a wad of notes into his palm and watched the city move again. That first night at home, Jacob folded the money like a private victory.
It bought stationery for Helen's school until the following term. It paid for Mariam's small list of debts. For 3 days, the house smelled less of worry. When the door closed behind him and he saw the leap of recognition on his daughter's face, relief made his face ache. Mariam kept her hands on the small tasks, measuring patience into the cups of tea she brewed. She had always been a woman whose pride was a second language. She measured it out in the way she straightened pillows and folded clothes and refused charity when it came wrapped in pity. But she was practical. She had eyes for numbers and for how things could go wrong. She asked where the money had come from when Jacob told the story, and she listened like a judge. "A tip is one thing," she said, eyes even. "A card is another. What business does a woman like that have with us?" Jacob did not answer with the whole truth. Truth in their house could be a blade. He told her that the woman had been kind, that she had been alone and upset, and that her gesture was nothing more than that. Mariam nodded and said nothing about the half-hour Jacob had spent wiping a foreign dashboard clean of dust. She said nothing about the look in Amanda's eyes when she had taken his hands, an unguarded, rare thing that felt to Jacob like warmth. When he slept that night, the city hummed underneath him, and he dreamed of a small window of light on a plastered wall, money placed neatly on a chair, a child's face that needed shoes. He did not dream about the bright house with chandeliers and quiet rooms where footsteps did not echo. The gap between them was something he had learned to live with like an old scar. The call came 2 weeks later, like a thread pulled through cloth. The number on the card flashed on his phone. Jacob stared at it until the courage grew like a slow tide, and he answered. "Can you come now?" Amanda's voice was a low thing, unexpected. "My car is not starting again." He walked across the city, past the market that smelled of fish and onions and the small men who traded in batteries, and found himself at the foot of a house that breathed money. The driveway spilled into a garden that someone had dreamed into existence and had the right to maintain. Alhaji Musa, a driver with a face like a weathered map, took Jacob's name and let him in with the practiced hush of a man who kept secrets for a living. Inside, the house opened like a mouth to another universe. Marble that tasted cold under shoes, a chandelier that caught the sun and sent it back in 1,000 soft knives.
Amanda met him in the foyer, wrapped in a shawl that did not belong to his world. She was 65, and the years sat on her like a history book, silver at her temples, a slow ease to her shoulders, but her eyes did not belong to the ledger of age. They had a clarity to them, like one who had looked a long time at her own reflection and decided she had been honest with herself.
"Jacob," she said, and the name felt like a key. "You came." He checked the battery again, hands moving with practiced economy, and this time she insisted he stay for tea. They spoke of small things at first, cars, the city, the ridiculousness of traffic. But under the words there was a steadiness that made him relax. She spoke of an empty house and a life built of measures and mergers, of the quiet that followed the phone calls she made at odd hours to business partners who wished to be listened to but were more comfortable with their own voices. He did not tell her where he spent his evenings, how the lights in his house blinked back like a small apology. He did not tell her about Miriam's neat order and Helen's wide, honest face. He listened when she told him about failed marriages and surgeries and the long ledger of sorrow that had filled the ledger of her living. She did not ask for miracles. She spoke of small comforts. The secret friendship began like most secrets, slowly, without intention. She called him to the house for small repairs, a loose hinge, a faucet that murmured. He went because she paid, but also because he found in her something he had not expected, a person who liked to listen. They drank tea in the quiet of a room that smelled faintly of roses. She told him the names of her children's children, distant, enough to be spared the familiarity of his own worries. Rumors moved like a second wind through the workshop. Men who used to tease Jacob about driving the same rusting motor now looked at him with a different tilt of curiosity. He avoided eyes where possible. His shame had feathers, and it made him uneasy to find them visible. Miriam grew quiet at first, and then louder with suspicion. "A card," she reminded him once, folding a shirt with practiced hands. "You were friendly to her," Miriam said. "You have a kind heart for people who don't have any reason to be kind to us." Jacob heard accusation in those words, and he also heard fear. Payment had changed their small world in a way that made her uneasy. She warned him in gentle ways, "Do not let kindness become obligation," and in harder ways, "I know what people like us are given and what they are expected to pay." Helen, 8 years old, slept with a pastime of paper dolls and homework that wrinkled under the weight of her curiosity. She asked questions too bright and sharp for the house. Why do people call Daddy Mr. Fix-It? And why does the lady's house look like a hotel? Jacob folded his answers around the child's sleep. He wanted to shelter the small world he had made with Miriam against the glitter he had fallen into, but shelter takes money, and money wants to be used. Amanda learned things about him without ever asking too plainly. She watched his hands. She noticed how he flinched at the clink of coins. Once she invited him to a small dinner and asked plainly if he drank coffee. "No tea for you," she said, with a rare smile.
"We will have what you like." He thought of Miriam when he took the evening walk to her house, a thinness of chest where guilt could lodge. The city went on. Street hawkers sang in melodies that threaded through the air like bright beads. Boys kicked at a balloon and laughed. Jacob ate slowly at a table where silverware felt like a promise. He told himself the visits were only about fixing and kindness. He liked the way she spoke to him as an equal, not as a man merely needed by circumstance. There was a dignity in that, and it wrapped around him in a way that made the long evenings lighter. Then the news came like thunder in a dry season. Amanda's phone call was sudden, a sound that startled him awake from a small, contented stupor. "Jacob," she said, voice high with something he couldn't name. "The doctor, come." The clinic smelled of antiseptic and hope. Jacob sat on a plastic chair that knew the weight of many uneasy bodies and held his breath for someone else's respiration. He watched the monitor with the rest of them when the doctor placed the probe and drew a dark round image on a screen. He had seen such screens only in films. "It's very rare," the doctor said, as if stating the weather. "But it happens. We're going to run a few tests. How far along do you think? Do you have any symptoms?" Amanda's hands were steady in a way that surprised him. She laughed once, softly, and it sounded like something that had slipped out of her chest and found the sky. Jacob's response was nonsense and honest at once. "I'm happy for you." It landed clumsy, like someone who had been handed a map in a foreign tongue. He was glad. He felt a beam of joy that skittered under the shame of the town's gossip. But he also felt fear.
A woman pregnant at 65 was not a simple matter in a place that loved stories, but feared scandal. If the news found Miriam, the small house they had built might unravel. If it found his neighbors, they would have names, and names grew teeth. Amanda's joy was private at first. She took a few days away from the front pages of the phone conversations that had always filled her life, and walked through the garden she had forgotten to tend, as if a seed had germinated under the stone. When she told Jacob, she spoke like someone with a secret that glowed. He came to the house and they sat in the library when she described the ultrasound in a voice that vibrated with wonder and a strange, hungry hope. There was a tenderness in her that unstitched things in him he had not known could be released. Not everybody felt wonder. Sympathy has a short inventory, and jealousy keeps accurate lists. America measured what she had against what the world offered, and found it wanting. She was Amanda's twin, similar in bone, and yet worn differently by life.
Where Amanda had married and remade herself into a kind of iron presence that could build companies from ideas, Amarka had been shaped by dependence, living on the margins of a sister's largesse, wearing the benefits of kinship like clothes that had not been earned. She had kept her sons around the family table the way a captain keeps a crew, strict with brow and tongue. Amarka had never hidden her resentment. She watched the house with the devotion of hunger and noted the change in Amanda's pace. When Amanda began to leave the house less and call more, when she spent money on small things as if testing the feel of them, Amarka's watch tightened. "She is playing with fire," she muttered to her boys. "There's always a price to what the rich throw away." She began to show her colors in private conversations. "If she has a child," Amarka told Emma over a cracked mug of coffee, voice low and sharp, "what of us? We have lived on crumbs because of her. Children will take the table. She will give everything to that child. And who will keep what I have kept?" Emma, her elder son, shrugged in a young man's way that tried to look unconcerned. Chisholm tapped his chin and put his money-faced eyes on his mother. The plot, when it started, did not open with malice. It opened with a question: how to secure what one believed was rightly theirs. Amarka spoke in the language she knew: fear, cunning, the small calculations of people who have little. She met an acquaintance who dealt with chemicals and bottles, and took the road that people take when they are certain they have nothing to lose. She bought a small vial, wrapped in paper, with enough cash to make the seller smile and look the other way. She put it in her bag like a secret, and felt the same small rush a gambler feels when the chips land in his hand. There was now a way. Amarka needed someone to do the delicate part, someone who could come close without suspicion. She weighed Jacob in her head. He was dishonest in her estimation, because he had been persuaded by the shine of another world. He had family, yes, but he had also been known to lose his bearings when money came. She had watched him accept coins and then spend them on a school fee like a bandage. He would be desperate, she told herself, and desperate people are easy to buy. She arranged to meet him at a place where the city kept its softer voices, a small restaurant off a side street where the lights were always forgiving, and conversations could flirt around the meaning of things without giving themselves away. Jacob arrived with an appetite and a heavy chest. He had come because she had called under the pretense of needing a mechanic's advice about a car she did not own. She sat like a widow of words, delicate and lethal. "Jacob," Amarka said, and he saw the tilt of entitlement that had lived in family meetings. Her perfume smelled like an old promise. "You have done well for yourself."
He answered politely, hands under the table, the heat of his shame a spark. She watched him with the coolness of someone playing chess with a child. She spoke of Amanda, soft, careful, with the practiced cruelty of one who would fold a life into a smaller measure. "She won't have her life taken from her by this child," she said. "She will give everything to whims. The boys will not be cared for. Do you understand how the family sits? Men like my sons need to be sure of their place." Jacob swallowed. The idea that one could measure a human life in the currency of security made him ache. He tried to find a moral foothold. He thought of Helen's slow breathing, of Miriam's forehead, the neat crease of worry there. "What do you mean?" he asked, and his voice was small in a big room. Amarka smiled like a woman who had thought everything through. She slid a small envelope across the table. Inside, a thick bundle of notes like a sudden harvest. "I've been generous to you before," she said, "but generosity will not protect us if we are pushed out. We need to make sure that child is not a problem. We need to keep the house safe."
She did not say the word, but the implication curled like a stick of smoke. Remove, prevent, take away. Jacob's breath narrowed. In his head, images crowded. The ribboned joy on Amanda's face, the child's small possibility, Helen's hands. The money was more than he had seen in months. It could pay for a door, a small store, an evening of reprieve. It could buy a future if he used it like a key. He told himself he would not be that kind of man. He told himself he would not be bought to harm another. He thought about Miriam and the quiet dignity in her hands. He looked at the money and felt a small animal stirring of need. Hearts can be bribed the same way fingers are, gently, with a promise of warmth. "Go home," Jacob said finally, and his voice was firm enough to be a shield. He pushed the envelope back across the table as if it had been poison. His heart beat like a drum between his ribs. Amarka laughed, but it had no joy. "You are wise, Jacob," she said, "but there are ways other than hands. Think, my son. Think of what a little help can secure. You will be set." He left the restaurant with the taste of metal in his mouth, and the city pressing around him like a hand. For a few days he tried to forget the meeting. He returned to the workbench, to the noise of clinking spanners and the honest ache of a job completed. He fixed a neighbor's generator and took home the small coin of thanks. He fixed a neighbor's headlight and came home with the warm glow of doing something right. He told himself that was enough. But the world has a way of leaking truth, and truths rarely wait for comfortable conclusions. A week later, on a late afternoon when the sun dragged itself low across clay roofs, Jacob found himself at the back entrance of Amanda's house again.
He had gone to collect a small repair bill, to cross a line of duty with the stealth of habit. He lingered near the servants' corridor, where the floor smelled of lemon and old wood. The house felt quieter than normal, like a book left open at a troubling page. He passed a door that hung only slightly ajar and heard voices, small and quick. The name of Emma, Amarka's elder son, slid into the air like a coin. Jacob paused. There was a cup on a side table and a bag loosely tossed over a chair, a movement of paper and the hush of conspirators. He should have kept walking. He told himself that. But curiosity is a difficult animal to starve. He saw Amarka move like someone who had rehearsed the steps of danger many times. She was talking low, and her hands were busy with a small bottle, wrapped in a paper towel. The bottle was dark, the cap tight. She poured a little of it into the rim of a glass, and then stopped, as if the sound had made her remember caution. "Careful," Emma said. He sounded younger than his years. "You can't be careless." Amarka's laugh was thin. "This is not carelessness," she said. "This is necessary." Jacob's hands went to his pockets and found nothing to steady him. He had come to fix engines, not to be the secret keeper of a decision so large it could break a life. A coldness climbed his spine, something that felt like the city had turned its face away and left him to his own reckonings. He backed away without a sound, the weight of what he had seen making his feet heavy. The bottle, the hush, the talk of necessary things, they were not for his clean conscience. They were for a plan, a violence wrapped in ordinary voice. He went back to the dark street and leaned against the wall of a small compound, as if the brick itself could hold him upright. For a long time he stood there, watching the houses breathe, children playing in the distance with the careless joy of those who have not yet been asked to count the costs of adulthood. The bottle sat under his tongue like a memory he could not spit away. Jacob thought of his daughter, Helen, who drew suns with extra rays to give them warmth. Helen, who had learned to read at the top of her small, proud voice. He thought of Miriam's hands and the way she smoothed a child's hair with a tenderness that had no price. He thought of Amanda's laugh when she looked at the ultrasound image on her phone as if it were a map of the future that had been denied to her. A miraculous pregnancy at 65 deserved the silence and the awe it had earned, not the shadow Amarka was ready to cast. A choice pressed on him like the heat of the day. He could go back inside and confront the family, expose what he had seen, call the driver, call anyone who had a name in the ledger of the city. He could bring both of them, the rich woman who had paid for fear to leave the room, and the woman who might have been consumed by the thought that she was losing everything. Or he could keep it, tuck the truth where needed truths go, and take a cut as Amarka had offered, use it like a ladder to climb out of debt and shame. The money could change things. It could buy a small house outside the city where the landlord's breath would not track them, where Helen's shoes would not be an incident. The thought of giving Mariam a life without this nightly gnaw of worry made his chest unclench in a way he had not felt in months. He straightened his back and did the only thing he had ever learned to do with tools and with difficult moments. He wrapped the heat into a plan the way he wrapped wire, carefully, without fraying. He went home that night with the image of the bottle tucked away like a splinter and the echo of Amarka's voice still in his ears. When Mariam asked him how his day had been, he lied with gentle hands. Sleep did not come easily. He lay on his back and watched the ceiling fan. Its slow revolution was a mockery of certainty. He turned the idea over and over. Take the money and allow a crime to happen, or refuse and risk the family's ruin because he would be marked as ungrateful. His chest felt like a pot on the fire, swelling with something he could not name. The next morning he woke with the taste of dust and decision. He walked past the market and into the day, and chose to do a strange thing. He went straight to Amanda's gate and asked for her. The driver knew him and let him in without fuss. He found her in the garden, standing near her roses as if prayer had become a small habit. "Amanda," he said, and the sound of her name loosened something that had been held too tight for too long. He did not have a plan to confess, nor the courage to accuse. He had only the small hope that telling someone would be a kind of cleansing. She looked at him with the same clarity that had first opened the card in his hands. "Jacob," she said, "you look tired." He told her haltingly about the meeting, about Amarka's words, moving fast and then slow with the gravity of a man saying something he could not take back. He told her that he had seen a bottle and heard a plan that made the world feel suddenly small and mean. He watched her face shift from surprise to a color he couldn't name. Amanda did not scream. She did not cry at first. Instead, she took his hands like a woman reaching for an anchor. "You did the right thing," she said, and even as the words came out, her voice trembled. "You could have taken the money," she said. "You could have used it. Why didn't you?" Jacob did not have a noble answer. He had looked at the bottle and at the money and thought of Helen and Mariam and felt something in him refuse to be bought into harm. "I couldn't," he said. "It was wrong." She held his hands longer than necessary and then let go like someone trying to set a bird free. "We will handle this," she said.
There was steel underneath the softness, a part of a woman who had fought long and known how to move through people like careful fog. "No one will hurt my child." There was a small relief in Jacob's chest, but it was ragged. The problem was not solved. Truth, once seen, refused to be wrapped back into the dark. It wanted light. It wanted reckoning. That evening, as dusk declared its blue over the city and the clamor died to a hum, Jacob walked home along a path that smelled of fried plantains and diesel. He felt for the first time in a long while like a man who carried a secret that could not be placed on a shelf. He pictured Amanda in a high-backed chair, the scale of her life suddenly tipped. He imagined Amarka moving through a house like a thief, plans coiled tight inside her. When he pushed his way through his door, Helen ran to him and climbed into his lap. Mariam's face was a study of exhaustion and careful optimism. Jacob sat with his daughter's head in his chest and felt both the smallness and the scale of what his life had become. Outside, the city slept in uneven measures. Somewhere in a house with marble floors and quiet rooms, a secret had been planned with the care people give to their darkest hopes. Jacob had uncovered it by accident. What he would do with it was a question that stretched like one of those long, empty streets in the evenings. He went to sleep with the image of the small, dark bottle in his head and the memory of Amarka's voice asking him what he was willing to trade for safety. He could feel in the marrow the shape of the decision approaching. It would require courage or cowardice, or both in a measure he was not yet prepared to measure. He had uncovered the dark truth. The city around him did not know. The night around him promised nothing. In the morning, things could change, or they could continue hurtling as before. But the knowledge lived in him now, a heavy thing, demanding a direction. Jacob had uncovered the dark truth. The weight of it sat in his chest like wet clay, and he carried it the way he carried heavy parts, close to the body, careful not to drop. He had told Amanda. He had refused Amarka. Now something larger moved towards consequence, the way a tide eventually touches the shore. Inside Amanda's house, the news did not erupt so much as gather itself. She paced the library only once, hands threaded at her back, then sat down and called Alhaji Musa. She did not call the police. Amanda preferred the language of control to the clumsy drama of procedure, but she began to assemble witnesses.
An older lawyer she trusted came by under a pretense of discussing a trust. A housekeeper who had worked for Amanda for 15 years was asked to stay close and to note anything unusual. Amanda asked Jacob nothing more than to be honest and to stay away from the gossiping streets. She needed time to move without being watched. Jacob left her house with a sense of small relief and a new fear.
The relief was that the secret was out of his hands. The fear was the noise that spilled from it. The neighborhood would not keep small things small for long. Rumors, once born, shied from beds and slept in doorways. He walked home along the route that took him past the night market, the vegetable stalls already closing, children playing marbles with the serious faces of those who learned early how to count loss. A man on the corner nodded at him and then looked away, the way people look away when a story begins and they are not sure which side to choose. At night, Miriam paced in the dark with the radio whispering in the background. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and watched her silhouette move like a slow argument. He had meant to tell her about Amanda's pregnancy, to take responsibility for the choices that had drifted them here. The plan had been to wait until he could gather the words without making them sound like excuses. The plan had been, in many ways, foolish. When he told Miriam about the bottle, her head bent like someone listening to rain. Her first reaction was a fierce, inward trembling that sharpened into anger. "So you went to her house," she said, and the words were not accusation so much as confirmation of a fear she had kept like a wound wrapped tightly. For what, Jacob? Comfort? Money? He could see all of it there. Her pride, her careful life, the way she had refused charity in front of neighbors to keep a dignity that had no price tag but still cost them. He thought of Helen and of school fees and of the night he had slept and imagined a life where shoes were the least of their worries. He thought also of how Amanda had listened to him, had seen him as a person rather than a man to be pitied. Those were not trivial things. "I told her the truth about America," he said finally. "I refused them. I couldn't. Miriam, I couldn't." Miriam's shoulders stopped moving for a long time. She did not forgive instantly. Forgiveness in their house was a work like folding laundry, repetitive, deliberate. But she also saw the bottle's image cross his face. She saw in him the moment he pushed away the envelope at the restaurant. She saw a man who had been measured by temptation and had, at the critical point, leaned toward what was right. "We will leave," she said. The words were not an instruction so much as a decision. Not because of her, because of the shame this town would put on you. Because you have done wrong enough already without being a target now. You go where we are no one's gossip. Jacob heard grief in that, but also a steadiness he had missed the entire time he had been swallowed by gratitude. She wasn't merely talking about leaving Lagos. She was offering another life in exchange for the erosion of pride. It felt like salvation and loss at once. Amanda moved in her own orbit of quiet fury. She did not let America know she suspected.
She hosted a lunch the following weekend, a neutral-sounding family call that drew the household in like a net. Candles were not lit. Guests were asked to keep the mood light. Amarka arrived with her boys, pretending the day was ordinary. She moved like a woman who had practiced play-acting at family affairs. Emma's smile had more teeth than warmth. Chisholm was younger and had that dangerous combination of loyalty and inexperience. Amanda sat at the head of the table with the control of someone who had learned how to steer large things. She served the soup herself and asked small, seemingly idle questions about the company and about a trustee. All the time she watched Amarka. She had seen the bottle in Jacob's recounting, had pictured it like an ugly star, and now she wanted to see if the constellation would align. When the plates were nearly empty, she excused herself to the kitchen, and Amarka followed as if curiosity were the most natural of steps. The kitchen was cooler than the rest of the house. Marble held whatever heat it had been given and returned it in low size. Amanda closed the door so it clicked a soft final sound and turned toward Amarka with the near impossible steadiness that comes from very old hurt. "You are more dangerous than you pretend," Amanda began, voice even and low. She did not shout. She did not need to. Amarka's face hardened like clay under sun. "I do what I must," she said. "You were the one who left us with nothing. Your life takes and leaves. I keep my sons alive." Amanda did not argue poverty with words. She set a cup on the counter and tapped it with her fingernail until the sound filled the small room. "I built what I built in spite of everything," she said, "not to be the source of your survival, not to be threatened because I choose another path." Amarka laughed in a way that was not free of tears. "You always thought you could buy people into loyalty," she said. "You never learned how to keep them." Amanda let those words sit like an accusation she had expected. Then she asked the thing she had kept for last. "Where did you get the vial?" Amarka's shoulders trembled. For a moment, something unguarded crossed her face. Shame, fear, and a raw, painful honesty. She said, "I thought I had to. My boys, what would they eat? Who would watch them if she had a child, another child, to take the house?"
Her voice gathered 1,000 small complaints she had kept for years. "I didn't mean—" She stopped because the words meant too much, and so tasted of betrayal. Amanda listened without interruption. She had been betrayed by marriages, by partners, by silence, by the way people allowed her to be reduced to a wallet. But beneath the betrayal was a deeper ache, a sister, twin no less, who had imagined that being close to the same body meant same entitlement. Amanda could feel the old, brittle longing of someone who had always measured kinship with an accountant's ruthlessness.
She felt pity and a burning clarity that the line between kin and predator had been crossed. "You will go," Amanda said finally. "You will leave this house and the property immediately. Take your sons, you will not return. I will have the lawyers ensure you receive nothing more. If you ever come back to threaten or to harm, I will take every legal step. You are no longer family in the ways that matter." Amarka's face shifted from anger to a kind of disbelief so pure it looked like pain. Her sons, on the edge of the doorway, having come to fetch their mother, met the news with varying degrees of outrage. Emma cursed softly, and then, because he had to protect the life he always thought his birthright meant, he raised his voice. "You can't do this to us," he said. "You built everything, and now you cast us out? What kind of woman are you?" Amanda did not answer with words designed to inflame. She answered with decisiveness. "I built this life," she said. "I will not allow cruelty in it. You have chosen a path for which you must bear the consequences. Leave now before I call someone to see this through properly." Amarka gathered what she could. She told her sons to take things with them, to take what would help them. And it was all so fast, like a small storm that leaves debris and bewilderment. The household buzzed after their departure, with workers murmuring and wondering. People whispered that a scandal had happened, that family fires had burned. But the thing burned in private, and Amanda sat in the empty kitchen for a long time after, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had cooled without her noticing. Jacob and Miriam did not stay for the spectacle. Amanda's offer, when it came quietly and with the directness of someone who had decided to fix what she could, was practical and without drama. "I will give you money to leave," she told them. "Go where you will not be watched. Start again. It is not charity. Think of it as paying back a debt." He had thought for a wild moment that the money she meant might be Amarka's envelope fallen into a different set of hands, some tainted exchange that would mark him again. But Amanda's offer had the precise quality of someone who knew how to gift without strings. She did not press them to take more than they needed. She did, however, make one condition: silence, and an agreement not to return to the house until Amanda called. Miriam hugged Jacob in the doorway and smelled his day's grease and fear the way she had always smelled him, the way someone remembers the old weather of a lover's life. "We disgrace ourselves in town, and we lose you," she whispered once, with a brusque tenderness. "But we will not be party to harm. We will go." They left Lagos before the rumors could thicken, carrying a few bags, Helen's favorite drawings rolled in a tube, and a small, guarded hope that their shame would not be a life sentence. Jacob felt a complex gratitude, ashamed for what he had once accepted, relieved that he had refused, and almost afraid of the life he was about to start, where no one knew his name. The town they chose was a coastal place 2 hours from the city, a quieter stretch where the sea cut its own rhythms, and communities still had spaces to learn one another's names. They found a small compound with a room that had a stubborn leak in the corner, and a landlord who liked hard bargaining. Jacob opened a little workshop that smelled of oil and new things, the smell of sawdust from a neighbor's wood, of roasted fish, of possibility. He fixed mopeds and smaller cars, and did so with the same dignity he had always carried. The difference was a new sense of being watched differently now, by choice, not by curiosity. Amanda did not disappear from their life entirely. She had limits. She was older, and the pregnancy at 65 held a physical impatience that made long journeys difficult. But she sent, discreetly at first, and then with increasing candor, small envelopes with money marked as assistance for the family. She left them books for Helen and paid for a small patchwork of tuition and supplies. Each gift came with a short note, for Helen, so that she can draw sunrises wider. It was impersonal enough to avoid embarrassment, personal enough to keep the thread unbroken. At the same time, Amanda moved through the days with a slow, strange freedom. What had been a gilded prison, appointment after appointment, schedules and boards, became, with the pregnancy, a new center. She walked the garden at dawn and watched the sky bruise and change.
She enrolled a midwife who specialized in elderly pregnancies, spent more time with her doctor in careful, private visits, and allowed herself in small moments to be visible in the way she had not been in decades. Her giving to Jacob's family was not just charity, it was a way to atone for family ties that had been mismanaged and to protect the fragile thing growing inside her. People watched Amanda with curiosity. A woman of her age pregnant would always make headlines in a city that loved stories. Some called it a miracle, others a scandal. She bore the public's talk the way she had borne all public attention, with a face that did not give away much. But solitude was less about being alone and more about the absence of anyone who knew her completely. Even with servants and lawyers and friends, the new reality made her acutely aware that wealth could buy things, but it could not purchase a true kin. Amarka's departure did not end the consequences. Her sons, bitter and humiliated, scattered. Emma took his anger like a coat and wore it, moving quickly into less reputable company and louder bars. He liked loud laughs and danger. Chisholm left for a neighbor town with minimal skills but intention, determined to build his own respect by whatever means he thought possible.
For a time, the city watched, anticipating a return, some violent retribution or a desperate scheme. But the wheels of their lives moved on with the slow inevitability of days. Amanda had made her decision. The law would sort the rest if it needed to. Jacob's exile, if it could be called that, became a slow learning of the derivative joys of small ownership. He woke before dawn with Helen sometimes pressed to his chest, then went to the workshop where the first day he mended a scooter for an old fisherman who paid with fish and a hot pan of plantain in lieu of full money. He learned to barter and to be comfortable with lesser measures, because lesser could be enough when pride did not weigh as heavily on shoulders. Mariam started sewing for another woman's boutique and taught Helen to be precise with lines and letters. In the evenings they ate on a small table and spoke less of what had been wrong and more of how to be useful. But Jacob's conscience was not a quiet thing. He had refused to be complicit, yet the memory of the bottle and the meeting in the restaurant haunted him. Sometimes under the ceiling fan in the dead of night, he wondered if he had made the right call to leave. Could he have protected Amanda more closely in town? Could he have brought Amarka to the authorities faster? Those forks of choice were always revealed in hindsight with sharper edges. Amanda's own nights were longer. Pregnancy at 65 was a delicate thing. Each ultrasound felt like a negotiation between science and miracle. The doctor who had first confirmed the pregnancy grew into a constant presence, a gentle voice who balanced optimism with caution. Amanda listened with a sort of tender disbelief. She bought small clothes she would not yet show anyone, and in the privacy of her bedroom she sometimes touched her middle and whispered promises to a child she had not yet met. It was not always joy. There were moments of fear when the body did not respond the way she expected, and tears would come, uninvited and honest. She also learned what it meant to be vulnerable in front of people who had only ever seen the shield she wore. She invited a neighbor who had also been widowed and knew the feeling of starting late in life. The neighbor would come with boiled plantain and stories, and in those visits Amanda learned to accept the small kindnesses she had always felt she did not need. She learned to let the world surround her. In Lagos, rumor morphed. Some pressed the story into the shape they wanted, Jacob as a man bought and sold, Amanda as a tragic figure who had been betrayed by family, Amarka as villain. Others were kinder, telling the story as a lesson about desire and its consequences. For Jacob and Mariam, the whispers were heavy at first, then lighter as distance did its work. Inside their home, they rebuilt trust slowly.
Mariam's forgiveness was a stitch-by-stitch labor. Jacob's repentance was not a single dramatic gesture, but a steady string of small acts, paying attention to bills, being home for dinner, teaching Helen, things that mended in ways apologies could not. Months passed. The pregnancy went on, and Amanda grew more inward as her body did what it needed to do. She hired a nurse who listened to the body's small changes and learned how to translate the physical into a manageable list of needs. She stopped taking appointments that could wait. She read to herself and to the tiny life on the growing curve of her belly. She thought often of the cost, what she had gained and what she had been asked to give. The rupture with Amarka was permanent, in a way legal rulings could not affect. She had severed the most intimate line of family and had paid the price. There was guilt, too, a feeling like a well that never filled, as if every act of severance left her with less of the simple, messy belonging she had once assumed came with blood. Jacob, remote from the center of scandal, began to consider the moral texture of his actions.
He had refused to carry out harm. He had brought truth to light. But he had also accepted Amanda's help in leaving. There was a small, persistent question in him. Had he taken the easy path in leaving, or the brave path? In the market he worked, people judged him less for what he had done and more for what they expected him to be. When trouble arrived, someone's scooter broke, someone needed a favor, he stepped forward, and the community learned to trust the man who refused to harm. Trust, he discovered, could be rebuilt more easily by actions than by words. One afternoon, nearly 9 months after the bottle's first appearance, Amanda invited Jacob and Miriam for tea. It was a gentle summons, no fanfare, just an envelope and a note with a time. Jacob wondered if it was to settle accounts or to ask them to return, and he rehearsed his lines on the walk there. He carried a small gift, a book for Helen and a hand-stitched scarf Miriam had made. When they arrived, the house seemed quieter than ever. Amanda greeted them in the foyer with a shawl over her shoulders and a softness in her eyes that surprised them both. Her belly showed now, round and undeniable, and there was a new map of lines in her face, not wholly born of age, but of a woman who had been through injury and mending. "I wanted to see you," she said, leading them to the garden where a small table had been set. "This family has been in my thoughts." Conversation was cautious at first, navigating the old cracks. Amanda did not make moral pronouncements. She did not require them to show gratitude. She only asked about Helen's schooling and Miriam's work, the practicalities of a life that had been uprooted and replanted. She asked Jacob whether he had thought about staying away forever, whether the distance had made things clearer. Jacob answered honestly, sometimes yes, sometimes no.
"People will say what they will," Amanda said. "There is the world and there is what we do inside it. I wanted to tell you that the house is open if you ever should decide to return, in whatever ways are safe. But more than the house, I wanted you to know that I have been thinking about the nature of family. We all make mistakes in how we love, and we also have to decide how to live with them." Miriam listened with the weariness of someone who had learned that words could be generous without obligation. "We are rebuilding," she said. "We are grateful for what you have done." Amanda nodded. "I wanted my child to have a community that understands cost," she said, with the kind of honesty that sounded like a confession, "not a life afraid of its own shadow." They parted with the small politenesses of people who had been through rupture and made the decision to continue. Jacob felt, as they left, a thin hope that the shape of their lives might one day feel whole again. Then the evening of the confrontation arrived like all endings, slow and then sudden. Amanda went into the hospital for a routine check. The midwife, who had been especially kind to her, took her hand as the monitors hummed their low, indifferent tune. "All is well," the midwife said, with a smile that carried years of practice. "The baby is moving more each day. You are doing beautifully." Amanda closed her eyes and let herself be present to the words. For a moment the world narrowed to the palm in her hand, the sound of the machine, and the steady assurance that despite everything, age, scandal, betrayal, there was a life moving within her, insistently human and beyond ledger. Outside the city, Jacob closed his little shop and walked home under a sky that had turned violet. Helen was at the doorstep with a piece of chalk, drawing suns and figures with the kind of joy that did not need permission. Miriam sang while she cooked, and Jacob felt a small lightness that had nothing to do with money and more to do with being safe for the night. Weeks later, Amanda's child came into the world in a quiet, respectful room with a doctor who had been part of her pregnancy since the first tremor of news. The baby was small and stubborn, with fingers that gripped with a fierce, new kind of will. Amanda held the child close, and the look on her face was a mix of awe and fatigue and a fierce ancestral protectiveness. The city had many things to say, but in that room words were secondary to the steady breathing of mother and child. Amarka, by contrast, had to forge a new life that required humility. She moved to a smaller neighborhood, and her sons scattered in different directions. She would call at times from afar, anger thin and brittle through the receiver, or she would disappear for days. The law had not bound her, but Amanda had made her choice, and the family had fractured as all broken things do, into smaller pieces, some sharp, some soft. Jacob did not return to the house in Lagos.
He sometimes thought of the marble floors, the security gates that swallowed footsteps, and the way Amanda had looked at him the first time they met, with a kind of honest curiosity. He wondered if he would have been able to resist again, to keep his hands clean when the city turned mean. He had learned that integrity was not a single flame,
but a practice of small decisions made in the presence of temptation. As the months settled, the small coastal town where Jacob and his family lived became, in many ways, their salvation. They were neighbors to fishermen and seamstresses, to a grocer who knew their names, and a teacher who complimented Helen's handwriting. Jacob's hands learned new tenderness. He mended a child's bicycle one morning and watched the grin that followed. The grin felt like payment for 1,000 small wrongs. Amanda watched the world from a house that had been rearranged not for guests, but for care. There were quiet nights when she walked the garden and felt the baby kick like a secret drum. She found the solitude kinder now, not because she was alone, but because she had the right to decide whose hands would hold her child. She had paid the price for severing kinship with Amarka, and sometimes she wondered if the cost had been too high. Yet when she rocked the baby and heard the small sounds of life, she felt no regret that she had acted to protect it. There were other small reckonings. The town paper in Lagos wrote about the matter with an appetite that seemed unsatisfied when rumor did not deliver spectacle. Amarka's sons found work that would not require the privilege they had once expected. Jacob's name returned to the kind of obscurity he had known before the battery call, a slow, honest anonymity that felt like a balm. People who had judged him harshly in the beginning now greeted him with a nod of recognition, not of judgment, but of understanding. Years did what days cannot. They burn away some memories and harden others into shapes people can carry. Helen finished a school year with honors, clutching a scholarship paper that felt like a small miracle. Jacob found a steady rhythm, and in spare moments sat at the little table and thought of the choices he had made. He had been a poor mechanic who had uncovered a dark truth about a 65-year-old pregnant billionaire. The headline of his life had been a scandal that could have ruined them all. But the truth, once out, had shifted the balances. People had fallen where they would fall. Some had been redeemed, some banished, some found new ways to live. The ending was not the sort of tidy conclusion that movies promise. Amanda, a woman of 65 who had given a life to the world in the flush of an unlikely pregnancy, found herself in a new pattern: community without obligation, independence without loneliness, and a child who became the center of her days.
Jacob and Mariam found, in the hard labor of starting over, a quieter dignity, one not bought with large notes, but earned in small, persistent acts of care. Amarka carried the consequence of her choices outward, a fracture that she might or might not mend in time. The dark truth had been uncovered by the poor mechanic. It had been the hinge on which many fates turned. Uncovering it did not restore innocence or erase pain. What it did was create space. Space for Amanda to choose whom she trusted, space for Jacob to rebuild his family's honor, and space for Mariam to decide the borders of forgiveness. Each of them carried scars, but also a clearer sense of what they would not trade for survival. On a late afternoon, months after the child had been born, Jacob walked to the edge of the beach with Helen on his shoulders. The water pulled a thin line on the sand, leaving shells and little treasures. Helen found a small white shell and pressed it to her ear like a secret. "Listen," she said to her father. "You can hear the sea." Jacob listened and found a deep, slow music that sounded like possibility. He thought of Amanda and of Amarka, and of the bottle that had sat like a threat in a kitchen. He thought of the long way a single choice could travel, from a small restaurant, across a stranger's hands, into the lives of many. He knew now that safety was not simply the absence of danger, but the presence of honest labor and steadfast love. Amanda, in her own house, watched the horizon from a window and held the child against her chest. She would be a mother in a way that had no precedent in her family, and she would do it with a mixture of fear and fierce joy. There were nights she would wake, hands searching for a partner who would not come. There were days she would sign papers and make decisions, still the head of companies, still a force in the world. And there were moments, small and private, when she would take the child outside and show them a mango tree and the way the light took its leaves. The story did not end in a courtroom or in retribution. It ended in the small, stubborn ways people create lives after a storm, with a repaired bicycle, with a seam that held,
with a child who learned to draw suns with too many rays because someone had once given them the space to do so. There were open questions: Amarka's future, the possibility of reconciliation, the ways gossip might one day return. But there was also a definitive thing. Choices had been made, and those choices had built the scaffolding for new lives. For Jacob, the act of uncovering the dark truth had cost him pride, but it had returned something he had almost lost: the ability to sleep at night without his conscience biting at him. For Amanda, the pregnancy at 65 had been both a miracle and a crucible, something that left her richer in love, but poorer in the naive trust that had once made family easy. For Mariam, the decision to leave had been a bitter medicine that healed.
For Amarka, exile taught what anger rarely does: how to be small and still survive. They each carried the lesson differently. Amanda with stern compassion, Jacob with the patient, daily work that mends both engines and hearts, Mariam with a careful steadiness that refused to be softened into sentimentality, Amarka with a hard reckoning that had to be worn and learned from. If you are moved by stories like this, by choices that bend lives and by the quiet work of rebuilding, then stay with us. There's more to come. The threads of these lives are not severed, and loyalties can shift again in ways that will surprise you. Subscribe to follow what happens next and to see how people we call flawed find ways to be whole.